what's your name anyway?
Hey, kid, there's a big shot gangster. He's putting together a crew.
You think everything sounds like a bad idea.
If you come with me, you're in this life for good.
I waited a long time for a shot like this. I got a really good feeling about this.
Nothing will stand in our way.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
I will finish what you started.
Who are you? I'm no one. There are stories about what happened.
It's true. All of it.
The Force. It's calling to you.
May the Force be with us.
My nerd world.
Just let it in.
Ujaba.
Why does she get a blaster and I do?
Ujaba.
If you don't know this, then you're going to find out. But Mark Hamill likes to troll people on social networking. He tweets a lot. Like a lot. Comments on everything. I ignore a lot of it. I like me some Mark Hamill, Luke Skywalker, but I like Mark Hamill playing Luke Skywalker. Be that as it may, he likes to have fun on Twitter and has teased during the production of both The Last Jedi and The Force Awakens, you know, things like trailer, and then it shows his trailer and stuff like that. He's kind of, he kind of does the dad jokes of social networking when he trolls. Well, he put on Instagram this week. All he wrote was and then he wrote to be continued. Okay, so, of course, within the Star Wars fandom, we all go, oh my gosh, is the title of Episode 9 going to start with the, right, or the, however you want to pronounce it. What does this mean, right? Who knows? He's also filming some TV show, so it could be in reference to that. It could very well be that he knows the title of Episode 9, and he did indeed give away that it starts with the. It's funny, too, when you look at people's reactions, because I remember, and we've gotten better as fans about doing this, but I remember that people actually thought, and look, I read into it, I think I talked about it on previous shows, they thought that there was some type of sort of rhythm or expectation based off of previous titles of the Star Wars movies, what movies would be called. Now, granted, George kind of did that when you look at, Return of the Jedi, Revenge of the Sith, and people would do it with the opening crawl, too, that it had to meet a certain criteria grammatically and word count and things like this. And the reality is that's just not the case. And I heard some people commenting that it would be weird that we would get The Force Awakens, The Last Jedi, and then another The movie. But at the same time, a title is just a title. All of this got me to thinking of all the titles that I've heard so far for Episode 9. None of them really stick out to me. The New Order or A New Order, this kind of thing. I've heard a lot about that, and the spark that lights the fire, or the spark, or whatever, spark of the resistance. One that popped into my head, as often happens when I start the show and I'm listening to the intros, was The Way of the Force. Right? I kind of like that. I doubt it's going to be the title, but looking at wrapping up the trilogy, the sequel trilogy, and talked about the fact that title should be kind of positive. You don't want to go out on a negative, right? Return of the Sith, this kind of thing. For the last of the Star Wars saga films, I would think you'd want a title that was leaning towards this is the finale and something that's more either neutral or positive than something negative, right? And not like Attack of the Clones. And I like The Way of the Force, or The Ways of the Force. I think that works really well, especially when you consider what this movie will probably do when it comes to Ben Solo and Rey, and that would harken back to what Kylo had said in episode 7 to Rey that really got her tapped into the Force. I'll show you the ways of the Force. I kind of dig that. I would be happy and kind of excited about that. So if it turns out that's the title, then you heard it here first. Unless you heard it someplace else, then you heard it there first. Welcome to episode 140 of the My Nerd World, the Star Wars podcast. I am your host, Jon Justice. Right up front, I want to thank everybody who went to MacWeldon.com, used the promo code MNW for My Nerd World and getting 20% off of your order. You still can, so if you haven't gone there yet, treat yourself to some of their amazing clothes, t-shirts, boxers, socks, got a bunch of accessories there as well. Again, MacWeldon.com. Use that promo code MNW. It'll still get you 20% off. Also, to everybody who has written in to be part of the mailing list, as I mentioned on last week's show, I kind of divulged that I have written a novel anticipating that it will be available come November, and if you'd like to be the first to get all the details, it will be a multimedia project, all original science fiction space opera story. Drop me an email, talkshownerd@gmail.com, and you will be on the mailing list, and you will be the first ones to get all of the details on my book and the multimedia project, where you can get it and in what forms you can get it. I'm super excited about it. I can't wait to share it with everybody. It's been a multi-year project and still hammering it out, but I'm really, really excited to get it out into the world, and I really hope that you guys enjoy it. So again, talkshownerd@gmail.com. If you haven't done it already, I'll add you to the email list, and you'll be the first ones to know all of the details about my project. All right, on the show today, we're in a weird spot in Star Wars right now when it comes to news. There's just not a lot going on. I mean, we have the Solo digital release, and so Disney, Lucasfilm are obviously focused on pushing that. We are going to talk the bulk of the show today about Solo. I've got some really, really cool stuff to share with you. I'm super excited about this. Plus, we'll get into just a couple of listener feedbacks this week, not a lot, based off of the amount of time I want to spend with this new information that the son of Lawrence Kasdan, Jon Kasdan, put out in honor of the digital release this week of Solo, a Star Wars story. We'll share that. I'll share that with you. And in just a moment, I want to talk a little bit about Resistance before we dive into the topic for this week, which will include this behind-the-scenes info from Jon Kasdan. But I want to talk for a few minutes about the influence of the directors of the Disney-era films. That'll be the bulk of the show today, and again, towards the end, we'll get you just a couple of listener feedback emails. I have more to do with listener feedback. A lot of you guys have written as of late, but there's just not a lot of time this week. So I think next week, when we're in that in between week between the digital release and the physical release of Solo, we'll get into more of the listener feedback that you've sent in. So if you don't hear your email or your comment on YouTube on this week's show, don't worry, I've got it, and we'll get to it on one of the shows coming up, most likely next week.
Something inside me has always been there, but now it's awake, and I need help.
I am getting more and more excited for Star Wars Resistance. I know it's a kid's show, but the more of the animation that I see and scenes from the show, it looks like a lot of fun. Like, I am really excited to watch this with my soon-to-be 12-year-old. There was a new featurette that was put out this week. If you haven't seen it yet, I would encourage you to go and seek it out. It's kind of like the other featurettes, and we played, I think we played one on last week's show. This one focuses on the characters themselves, being the pilots on the Colossus, which is the platform, and how the war hasn't reached them yet, and so they're kind of left to their own devices, doing races and bettering their piloting skills. It looks like a lot of fun, and the fact that the show is called Resistance gets me excited because it looks like we're going to see And I don't think it'll be covered in depth, but it looks like we're going to be able to see some of the beginnings of the First Order. We have seen some footage of some First Order stormtroopers in the show. We've also seen in this latest featurette, we saw Kylo Ren's command shuttle. And I know some people have mentioned that in the Star Wars canon, that particular large-winged shuttle is not exclusive to Kylo Ren. Apparently that ship is used quite often when it comes to the First Order. So I'm wondering if it's kind of the First Order version of the Imperial shuttle that was featured so heavily in Return of the Jedi, even though we've only seen one. What's interesting about that, too, is I actually have one of the original releases for the smaller Titanium series toys, the die-cast toys for the vehicles. The original release of Kylo Ren's command shuttle was actually white like the shuttle Tidarian. Now, if you look at some of the art that was released at the start of the promotion of The Force Awakens, it was clear that there was some artistic questioning over what color it was supposed to be, because I even have I think I actually have a t-shirt that has that same white shuttle. So it might have been painted white. That shuttle, too, I don't know if you know, and I've talked about this before, but if you haven't heard me mention it, I'll mention it again now since we're talking about Kylo Ren's shuttle. I'm pretty sure the wings didn't fold out on that they stuck straight up, and that was changed before the movie came out, because all of the original toys that came out for Kylo Ren's command shuttle, the wings didn't move. It was only in the later iteration. Actually, it was only in the versions that came out for The Last Jedi that the wings actually folded out. All of the artwork, the toys, the models, everything else had those wings stuck in that upright position. Now, again, that could have just been merely none of the artwork that was given to the toy manufacturers just showed the wings fanning out. I think they look better fanned out. Don't misunderstand. I just think I find that stuff fascinating. In case you haven't noticed. Anyway, back to Resistance. Star Wars Resistance looks like a lot of fun. I'm really looking forward to it. The animation looks awesome. I'm a big, as I've talked about before, big fan of the vehicles of Star Wars, and the fact that we got a bunch of new ships, and actually one of the guys who's one of the older pilots in the group on Star Wars Resistance, he flies a heavily modified TIE fighter, which is incredibly reminiscent of some of the concept art that was used for Revenge of the Sith when they were switching up the look of the Jedi Starfighter, and it started to get closer to looking like a TIE fighter, especially the window of the cockpit. It was kind of a cross between the Jedi Starfighter that we ended up seeing in Attack of the Clones, combined with an original trilogy era TIE fighter. This looks like one of the pieces of concept art. It looks awesome, and I personally cannot wait to get the toys, and I'm excited that we only have to wait a few weeks before we have the opportunity to go and watch Star Wars Resistance.
Will you have a spark that'll light the fire that'll burn the First Order down?
I want to spend a little bit of time this week, and we're going to get into these behind-the-scenes tidbits, for lack of a better word, right, on the behind-the-scenes of the making of the film. Jon Kasdan, who wrote Solo, A Star Wars Story with his dad, Lawrence Kasdan, he put out 52 useless Solo factoids and tidbits for anyone who's interested. I'm not going to read all 52. What I am going to do, though, is I went through and I highlighted the ones that I liked. It is really, really cool. And if you have a chance to seek it out, I'll see if I can't put a link in the show notes. But if you have a chance to seek it out, I'm sure if you look up online 52 useless Solo factoids and Jon, Jon Kasdan, you'll be able to find it. It's really, really good stuff. And what this got me thinking about was the influence of the directors on the Disney-era movies, and how each of them, sometimes through the director itself, sometimes, in my opinion, through the art department and other people involved in the project, each one of these films that has come out in the Disney era, they all have a unique and particular stamp on them. And I know that George Lucas and his original idea for Star Wars was to be more like James Bond, where there would be a different director. And that was certainly the plan going into the original trilogy. Even though most people, when you watch the behind-the-scenes stuff, you know that George was heavily involved in both The Empire Strikes Back and especially Return of the Jedi, before he went and directed all 3 of the prequel films. And as I've mentioned before, the prequel movies, to me, are the most cohesive trilogy of all of Star Wars. Just in terms of flow, style, visual effects, it really does rank up there, regardless of how you feel about the quality of the films. In terms of consistency, it is much more akin to, say, Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings films were incredibly consistent just right across the board. They all very much, you can watch one into another if you wanted to watch one epic film. And if you didn't know, you wouldn't be able to differentiate between movies. Harry Potter's not really that way. Matrix is that way, regardless, again, of how you feel of the movie. The original Matrix trilogy, to me, top to bottom, especially the second 2, they all really flow together well. But you can't say that totally for the original trilogy. Okay, they do, especially when it comes to special effects, but they are all very unique. And the same thing rings true for this sequel trilogy. It'll be interesting to see what kind of flavor J.J. Abrams brings to Episode 9 and how much it feels like The Force Awakens. But getting to my bigger point, I basically wrote some notes down here leading into Jon Kasdan and his useless factoids and the ones that I picked out to share with you. But starting off with J.J. Abrams and his influence on the Star Wars films, in my opinion, he really modernized Star Wars. He took a story that originated a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away and utilized all of the available technology and newer storytelling techniques that we've become accustomed to as filmgoers and applied it to the Star Wars universe. Like, imagine if, this would be really, really different, if the prequels were done today by today's special effects standards and what we've grown accustomed to in how the special effects and CGI actually looks. The prequel trilogy still looks good, but there are moments in those films that aren't as good. It was George pushing the visual envelope of special effects. If you made the prequels today by J.J. Abrams, we'll just use that as the reference point, by J.J. Abrams standards special effects, they would look drastically different. I mean, and that to me is really exciting. And I've mentioned this before. I would have no problem if they were able to do it, of going back to the prequel movies and even the original trilogy, for as sacrilegious as that might be for somebody. I would have no problem with going back and doing a special edition updated version and cleaning up a bunch of the special effects that just didn't quite work. Because George really, really pushed the envelope. Now, don't misunderstand. There's some stuff in the prequel trilogies look great. There's just moments in there where the CGI work, especially when it comes to some of the room settings, it just, for me, in those brief moments, it takes me out of the film. As much as it does the end of Return of the Jedi, when Lando and Han are talking before they take off for Endor, and the matte painting, it just doesn't work for me at all. Okay, so moving forward, you go to Gareth Edwards and Rogue One. I don't think the stamp on Rogue One is so much that of Gareth Edwards, but more the art department in completing and being successful in their attempts to make a modern-looking Star Wars film that still fits right within the original trilogy. That, to me, is kind of the legacy of Rogue One, is that they did a really, really good job of making sure that that movie fit in well with A New Hope. even though we were light years apart in terms of special effects. And even when you go to the special edition, I mean, there was a lot of stuff in A New Hope that I feel like George could have easily gone and fixed up and spruced up a little bit, and he didn't, and I'm totally okay with that. But when you consider the Falcon escaping Tatooine before they head off to the Death Star, that scene you could have easily spiced up a little bit with the ship movements. Even the battle with the TIE fighters leaving the Death Star, you could have worked with. And again, I'm fine that George didn't do that, but when it comes to Rogue One, that was a real difficult task that they had of not taking you so far removed from it. And the battle at the end over Scarif, I think they really, really nailed it. It has really a visual look, even though the effects are much better, but it has a visual look akin to that battle at the end of Return of the Jedi. Then you move over into The Last Jedi and Rian Johnson. And Rian Johnson's love of classic Hollywood movies, 30s, 40s, and 50s, it's clear if you follow him on Twitter, right? He loves that. He loves that era of Hollywood, that classic era of Hollywood. It really did seep right into The Last Jedi, and that movie benefits from that love. It's the closest thing of all these new Disney-era movies that any of the new films have gotten to the way that George Lucas did not just A New Hope, but also the prequel trilogy. And the prequel trilogy was very much designed in a particular way that was still looking at the Saturday serials, but the way that he directed the actors and the way that he wrote those movies was going back to the real early, 20s and 30s, like the dawn of filmmaking. Is very specific in style. And it's clear throughout all those films. I mean, that absolutely rings true. It just didn't resonate with a lot of people. The documentary, and I can't remember which one it was, but the documentary that broke down some of the Buster Keaton-esque footage and matched it up with what Jar Jar Binks did in The Phantom Menace, it's clear that's what George was inspired by, and I really appreciate that. I do think it's goofy when Jar Jar goes on his big adventure during that final battle in The Phantom Menace. I don't particularly care for all of that, but I really do respect George for what he was doing. He wasn't being silly just for silly's sake. He was doing his own homage. But Rian Johnson and the way that he injected this timeless feel to, again, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, really sets The Last Jedi apart in tone, in look, and feel. That's why that movie resonates so much with me, because it has that classic look to it, and it's incredibly timeless. More so than The Force Awakens. I mean, The Force Awakens is great, but it's a modernized version of A New Hope. I'm not talking about in terms of storyline. I'm not doing the it's a ripoff. I'm just saying that J.J. Abrams was going to establish Star Wars again for the next generation in the Disney era. He did basically just a very modern version of A New Hope, whereas Rian Johnson said, I want to make something that's got a classic feel to it, and he really, really pulled it off in my opinion. And then you get to Solo, okay? And Solo's different because Solo looks and feels different, yet still fits right into the Star Wars universe. I watched it again last night. The more I watch that film, the more I enjoy it. And it was, again, it's a lot like The Last Jedi, but in much different ways. But every time I've watched this film, I've really grown to appreciate it. I mean, this goes back to last week's "You Fall in Love with Star Wars Movies" comment. And watching it again last night, I realized that so much of the reason why that movie works and still feels like Star Wars is the level of attention to detail in the writing and in the little tiny tidbits here and there that connect it all together. It's interesting because Solo, to me, it's such a departure. Like that, Solo is the big departure. I don't really look at Rogue One as being a standalone film, even though it is, just because it is so closely connected with A New Hope. Solo is really just its own little story, and I love these characters. And to me, the care that the Kasdans put in, and specifically and mostly Jon Kasdan, really shows through. It's such a bummer it didn't do better at the box office, and we're not going to go into that right now, because before I was kind of like, yeah, if we get a solo, another solo movie, and if we don't, I'm fine with it. Now I really want one. I would really love to see the story of Han going to the big shot gangster looking to put together a crew, and Jabba the Hutt, and seeing what happens there that brings us to when we see him and Chewie at Mos Eisley in A New Hope. I really want to see that story. I'd love to see more of Kira and Darth Maul and see where that goes. But that film really, you can tell that Jon Kasdan really took time and care to make a special Star Wars movie that hit all the notes that he wanted it to hit and had enough stuff in there that it was connected in ways that most of the audience didn't even realize it was connected. And with that, let's get to these factoids and tidbits from Solo: A Star Wars Story, because there's some really, really great stuff in here that Jon Kasdan has decided to share with us.
This is not going to go the way you think.
All right, so here are just a few of the useless Solo factoids and tidbits for anyone who's interested from Jon Kasdan. And again, I found all of this stuff absolutely fascinating, and it really added a depth of appreciation for Solo: A Star Wars Story that I did not have prior to reading these. So we'll just run through again. These are the ones that stuck out to me that I wanted to share on the show this week. The name of the White Worms, and this would be Lady Proxima at the beginning of the film. The name The White Worms is an homage to a thoroughly mediocre Bram Stoker novel, The Lair of the White Worm. In the original script, they were not worms at all, but described as well-dressed vampiric albino aliens a la David Bowie in The Hunger. Once Chris and Phil, this would have been Lord and Miller, these were the original directors who left the film before Ron Howard went and took over. But so once Chris and Phil got involved, they became actual worms. Mother Proxima's design evolved through the production. The element that stuck from the very beginning was their sensitivity to light. Now, along those same lines, this is probably one of my favorite little tidbits of this of what Jon Kasdan shared. He wrote this: "Of course, Han told Leia the story of how he and Kira broke out of the den of white worms, and that's what gave Leia the idea to pull a real thermal detonator when disguised as a bounty hunter, Bosch, in Jabba's palace in Return of the Jedi. And for anyone that feels that maybe that didn't need to be explained, you're crazy. It had to be explained." I dig that. I obviously saw the parallel in the movie when he's using the rock and pretending it's a thermal detonator, but I didn't think for a second that perhaps Han had told Leia about the story and that's where she got the idea from. I just think that's cool. The name Moloch is a nod to Allen Ginsberg's poem Howl. You should read it if you haven't. It's a good poem. And again, this is Jon Kasdan. And Moloch is the guy that's chasing Han at the beginning of the film. He's in the Stinger speeder. He's got the mask. Looks kind of like a dinosaur face to him. It's pretty cool. Very Jim Henson. Of all the creatures on Corellia, in my opinion, are very Jim Henson-esque. Cornet Spaceport was the name that we found on Wikipedia while looking for spaceports on Corellia. We wanted a sequence to feel like the Ellis Island sequence in The Godfather Part 2 to give a sense of how small Han and Kira are in the scheme of things, and the cruel, impersonal machine that is the Empire. We, Kasdan, he goes on to say, spent many a Christmas while I was growing up in the Rocky Mountains of southern Colorado, which is only odd when you consider that none of us ski. The environment on Vandor, one, was meant to evoke that beautiful landscape. It also made sense for the space western feeling that we were trying to invoke. In retrospect, Thandie Newton may have actually been too good and too interesting as Val. It was always in the design of the story that Beckett would lose his trusted crew members during the conveyance job gone wrong and be forced to rely on newbies. Han and Chewie, and this would open the door for Lando and Kira and L3 to join the crew. But Thandie is so compelling to watch that the death of her character feels like a cheat. It's an odd and unexpected problem that comes with working with such amazing, compelling actors in the Star Wars universe. You just want more of them. Yeah, I thought that was really, I thought that was interesting because I personally really liked Val and Rio and would have liked to have seen more of them in the film. But, you know, when you're telling a story and you've crafted a story, like, you don't want to hold back on those characters and make them less interesting just because you're going to end up killing them off. So I can understand why, and I was cool. It was cool to see John sort of address that, you know, Thandie Newton did a great job as Val, that when she's killed off, we're kind of like, oh, that really sucks. But to me, it also adds a little bit more weight and gravity to the situation as well. Kira casually references an Ithorian antiquities dealer named Doc Ondar. Remember that name. You'll see it again someday. That's interesting. See, I just like that. I like the fact that there's things in this film that will be brought about at some point in time in the near future. There was a Hollywood insider, too, just as a side note, since we're talking about the future and what we may see. There was a Hollywood insider on Twitter who I've seen comment quite often, big Star Wars fan, not sure how close he is to Disney and Lucasfilm, but he made a comment that in 6 months, the fandom would be clamoring for a Star Wars Solo sequel. And I couldn't determine whether or not, and to be honest, I didn't look through the entire thread to see if the original poster commented again. If this was just opinion based off of the aging of Solo, that he thinks the fandom will really grow to love the film, you know, like I have, and that we'll be really wanting a Solo sequel, or if there's something coming up in terms of content that will drive a demand and desire, because 6 months is right around when Star Wars Celebration in Chicago should be taking place next year. All right, back to the tidbits from Jon Kasdan. The scene in Dryden's study in which the Kessel heist is first proposed is one of my personal favorites in the movie, he writes. It's where Han really becomes Han in a lot of ways. The way he improvises to save their skin in that scene felt true to the man he eventually becomes. We get the ship, we've already got the pilot, felt like pure Han. He goes on. The lodge at Fourth, I'm looking at this in an incredibly tiny font because these were like screen grabs off of Twitter. And I'm trying to, Fort Yapso, I guess that's how you pronounce it. So this is where they would go to meet up with Lando. So the lodge at Fort Yapso was something that came from Chris and Phil. They were inspired by Robert Altman's McCabe and Miss Miller and really wanted to have that dark, wintry mountain lodge feeling in the movie. Bradford's work on that particular set is especially beautiful and was an anchor for the book and the feel of the whole movie. Drop me an email or a comment on YouTube, talkshownerd@gmail.com. There's one part in the movie, and it has to do with this, that I wish there was one more scene. I don't like the fact that we leave Dryden Voss's yacht to go meet Lando, and suddenly we're walking up the steps of this winter lodge. Is that supposed to still be Vandor, or did we travel someplace else? I assume that's supposed to be Vandor, and that they just happened to be at the same spot where Lando was close by. I just would have liked to have seen just an additional scene right there to establish how they got to that place and how close that place was and why Lando was so close by, if indeed it was still Vandor. It's one of the things where in the special edition for Return of the Jedi, I really appreciated the addition of the scene at the end of Darth Vader leaving Endor to go back to the Death Star 2, where he gets in the shuttle. They added that all in the special edition. And it's one of the things in The Force Awakens that sticks out to me because they never quite explain how Kylo gets from the finalizer First Order Star Destroyer after the Hosnian system is destroyed, how he gets over to Takodano so fast. That's kind of a bit of a cheat. Anyway, all right, let's get back to Kasdan's comments here. L3 was a character conceived in conversations between Chris and Phil, Lord and Miller, Lawrence Kasdan, and myself. It's interesting to see how divisive she's been in these extremely divisive and politically charged times. If you're interested in that particular conversation, there's a great piece by Spencer Kornhaber in The Atlantic and another by Kate Gardner on the Mary Sue that illustrate differing points of view and passion feel about Star Wars. The truth is, she actually evolved out of Chris Miller's astute observation that it was funny that the bartender at Mos Eisley Spaceport objected to 3PO, considering droids seem to be the least rambunctious folk in the galaxy. Okay, so let's stop down here just real quick. L3 did not bother me at all. And especially in light of the observation that this is kind of a nod to, we don't serve their kind here, your droids, we don't want them here, right? It makes sense that you have a sentient droid that will be pushing back against those that would be judging them and discriminating against them in that way. I do really, really like that nod and that reference, and it makes sense to me. To what Jon Kasdan said about the politically charged times, and I've mentioned this a ton on the show, and I'm not on my regular radio show, my Monday through Friday news talk show. And I'm not going to wipe out on it here. I just want to say this. Look, it's always been politically charged times. The biggest difference right now, and the reason why it makes it seem like this is a much more politically charged time than ever, and that's not to say that there aren't circumstances right now where people are talking more about politics and are concerned for one reason or another, and I'm not going to get into that right now, but I am going to say that because of social networking, especially Twitter and Facebook, and the ability that so many people have to go and get their voices out there. I mean, look at how many Star Wars podcasts that are being produced on a weekly basis and how many new ones are popping up all the time. It's all just highlighted. You know, prior to the internet and prior to Twitter, you weren't bombarded with so many opinions. People still had them. They just didn't have a way to share it with everybody. So I say that because I don't think that L3 would even be considered a controversial character if it wasn't for the fact that Twitter and people on Twitter have the ability to talk about how they think she's a controversial character. I think in the minds of some people she might have been, but before we just kept that to ourselves or our closest friends. Now we anonymously share it via a Twitter handle and a made-up name without having to expose who we are. I'm not talking about me. I'm talking about other people. And we're able to go and put that out there for everybody to see, where before we just kind of kept that view to ourselves. All right. The scene where Han and Lando discuss their parents was in part inspired by Bruce Springsteen's autobiography, Born to Run. Interesting. Since so many characters in Star Wars are orphans and the product of some great tragedy, we wanted the story of Han's parentage to hint at something more complex and less romantic. His father led a working-class life full of disappointment, and he had a complicated, difficult relationship with his son. Han eventually ran away from that relationship. I like to think Han's father was still out there somewhere drinking himself to death. Lando's cape closet, another great idea that was pure Chris and Phil. That scene was always meant to be the parallel between Leia and Han in the avionics closet in Empire. We liked the idea of seeing Han in a similar situation, with a similar type of banter, but a very different partner, one who maybe teaches him a thing or two. The relationship between Han and Kira was never intended to be concluded at the end of this movie. It's a story I hope we get to tell more someday, because I like their diverging paths. And this is really the part of the movie that has really grown on me, that I've really gone to appreciate. I love the relationship between Han and Kira in Solo: A Star Wars Story. And I like that it is not your typical, doesn't she love me, Han chasing after him, after him. I mentioned this last week. I don't want to go down this road again, but I really love what they did with Kira. I love the fact that she, in the beginning, tells him to get away because she wants to see him safe. I love the fact that when they meet again, she's not mad at him for not coming back, and yet she still has feelings for him and isn't afraid to go and express those feelings. It makes it all the more poignant at the end when she leaves him. Because that, in my opinion, is heartbreaking. To have a woman who does legitimately care for you, but yet, because of the place she is in her life, cannot be with you, right? I mean, Han essentially could have had his mate. No, I mean, we know what happens later on with Han and Leia, so I'm not saying that's the appropriate way to go. But I'm just saying that here he has a person that he could actually have a relationship with, whom he's in love with, and yet she also loves him but can't be with him. I think that dynamic we don't see enough. It's the same in a very similar dynamic to what we get in Ready Player One, and I love that relationship between Parzival and Artemis because of that as well. That we don't have to spend a lot of time with these characters wondering, does she or doesn't she like me? We've kind of just established that up front, and we take a look at these complex romantic relationships in a different light than what we're so used to seeing in your rom-coms or your regular, I don't want to say regular storytelling, but sort of the cliched storytelling when it comes to romances in films. All right. The Maelstrom is another idea that stuck from the first draft, trying to solve the problem of how to make the Kessel Run visually exciting, inventive, and at least somewhat logical, weighed heavily on all of us throughout the process. It was something we discussed endlessly and knew would never satisfy everyone, and specifically never satisfy Neil deGrasse Tyson. We wanted a Jules Verne flavor, and we loved the idea of a storm in space, what that might look like. The Hubble image of the Pillars of Creation was a huge influence on this concept. ILM did tests in which they blew up canisters of different colored powder and photographed the explosion in slow motion. Those were fun to watch. And I love the Kessel Run scene. That is such a fun scene from beginning to end, and it's just the perfect right length, too. It really, really pays off. It's been a while since I've gone and watched A New Hope, and I'm looking forward to the next time I do watch it because I'm curious to see, now that I've seen Solo on so many viewings, what that does to my experience of watching A New Hope with all this backstory now cemented in my mind. Is Akira's made-up job title when they arrive on Kessel assistant to the Vice Admiral of Trade Route Allocation and Monetization a good-natured poke at some of the more confusing bits of exposition in previous Star Wars adventures? Of course not. We take this stuff very seriously. I think that's funny. I don't mind that either, right? Look, opening up the taxation of trade routes, right? It really is somewhat ridiculous. I get what George was doing, and George is allowed to do whatever he wants to do, and I don't let the crawl of the Phantom Menace ruin my enjoyment of that film. But in terms of really grabbing the reader of the crawl at the opening of the film was something interesting. You go the taxation of trade routes, and I never really thought about it when I originally saw the film, to be honest. It wasn't until people told me later on that I should be bothered by that, and then I went, yeah, okay, I guess that is kind of humdrum, but be that as it may, it doesn't ruin the enjoyment of the movie, and I like it when they do sort of acknowledge those types of things. That's funny to me. While figuring out the Kessel heist, we kept revisiting the Mission Impossible movies because we wanted the sequence to have the kind of momentum and feeling coordinated effort that the best sequences in those films always have. Ultimately, though, Han's personality is very different from Ethan Hunt. He's much more laid back, and things tend to go best for him when he just sort of BS's his way through it, which is why Han Solo is the patron saint of screenwriters. All right, he goes on. I wish there was a special feature where you see Beckett toss aside the Tantel armor and the Gondar tusk mask he uses as a disguise on Kessel. Then just settle into a time-lapse shot of that gear lying in a closet in the Falcon for like 15 years until Lando picks it up and wears it to disguise himself on Jabba's palace. And if you're wondering why or objecting to how interconnected the movie is with others, it's because that's the kind of nonsense I think about. When I was growing up, there was a stack of Star Wars Marvel comics in my grandparents' house in Michigan, Jon Kasdan writes. I assumed that they belonged to my brother. It remained there in exactly the same spot for 25 years. I really wanted the shootout on the landing pad at Kessel to evoke the feeling of those wonderful Marvel covers of the 1980s. Han and Lando, their blasters blazing. I think Ron Howard achieved that and then some. Seeing those three guys beneath the Falcon is an absolute realization of that particular childhood fantasy. Thank you, Ron Howard and George Lucas. And I will say this when it comes to, again, Solo, a Star Wars story, in that it really does evoke some of the real iconic imagery from those original trilogy films. That shootout on Kessel before they leave, when you want to talk about the modernization of the films, you go and compare that to the shootout of when they're leaving the Death Star, and they really do parallel one another, albeit the dynamic and the way the scene plays out on the Kessel heist in Solo, a Star Wars story is visually much more compelling than what we got on the Death Star. But it still really rings true to that that Star Wars aesthetic. I mean, I agree with him. It really is the stuff of comic books that we grew up with. Does the movie work? I'm not the person to ask, but here's what I think does work. The moment when Han jumps into the pilot seat of the Falcon for the first time. It's directed beautifully. Alden nails every moment and look, and unless you're actively resisting it, John Powell's perfect cue will make your heart swell. That moment is as good as this movie gets, in my opinion. I don't rank soundtracks either. I will say that right now, if I had to rank Star Wars soundtracks of all the films, it goes Empire Strikes Back and then Solo, a Star Wars story. I absolutely adore the soundtrack for Solo. It's one of the few Star Wars soundtracks that I actually actively listen to in the car, just driving around, because I don't normally just listen to soundtracks. But I really, really do love that soundtrack. And the one moment when they leave Mimban and Han and Chewie are standing underneath in the on the railing of the AT-AT hauler, and there's that soaring music that isn't necessarily something that we're used to hearing in a Star Wars movie. That moment is so great. The cinematography, the acting, the ship, all of it in that film. One of my favorite moments in the movie. An Imperial blockade was something we wanted to see the burgeoning smuggler deal with. We went through many iterations of that as well. For a long time, the idea was that the Falcon got stuck in a tractor beam, and Han has the idea to disrupt it by removing a small amount of coaxium, putting it into Lando's mini-ship, and launching the mini-ship at the destroyer. We even filmed this version, but it was incredibly time-consuming, and the Kessel run hadn't even started yet. Yeah, and it's funny because the full-size toy version of the Solo Millennium Falcon, that escape pod comes off, you can open it up, and it actually has coaxium in it. So that made it all the way through the toy phase before they went and changed it. Love it, hate it, or indifferent, watch the Kessel run on the best screen with the best sound you can find. It is truly a technical marvel of visual effects and sound design that really represents the state-of-the-art form at this moment. I'd put that sequence up against any visual effects in movie history. Rob Bredow knocked it out of the park. It's simply gorgeous. It's also a testament to Chris Roos, the brilliant writer and editor who came up with and helped us streamline the Kessel Run sequence and the Convex job. Yeah, it really, both of those are really some great action, both action pieces. All three of them are just spectacular in Solo. All right, the creature the Falcon encounters in the Maelstrom had a long road to the screen in the early drafts. It's the Summa Verminoth. The Summa Verminoth? The Kessel Run was interrupted with a forced pit stop on a spooky Ridley Scott-type planet. On that nameless planet, Beckett's crew encounters some enormous Lovecraftian monsters that claim one of their number. When Chris and Phil, Lord and Miller, got involved, they determined correctly that the pit stop would kill the momentum of the Kessel Run. Later, when working on the sequence with Ron Howard, the notion of a Lovecraftian monster returned. We're both huge H.P. Lovecraft fans. I remember Kathleen Kennedy would go into her office and Google images of giant squids and frilled sharks for reference. She loves that stuff. One thing we stumbled across while working on this was a fantastic short film teaser directed by Rurari Robinson called The Leviathan, if you can find it on YouTube and Vimeo. It has been long rumored to be turned into a feature, and I certainly hope it will be. The name Suma Verminoth is another Cthulhu mythos homage to Robert Bloch's fictional tome De Vermis Mysterious. I can't believe that was a lot of words. I dig that monster in the movie, though. Let's move on. All right. Aaron Kellyman, who was a discovery of Nina Gold and Chris and Phil that exceeded our wildest hopes for Enfys Nest. She has a face made for the movies and is, I believe, busy shooting a new version of Les Miserables as I write this. Personally, I'd love to see more Enfys Nest. Yeah, I would too. In many drafts of the script, Enfys number 2 was Bosk, who abandoned her at the end of the movie as he was truly a soldier of fortune. This was another thing I fought long and hard to keep, but was ultimately overruled. Whether or not you were surprised by Beckett's betrayal, it had a thematic inevitability to it. This moment was meant to rhyme with the moment in A New Hope when Han returns and saves Luke during the assault on the Death Star. In both movies, the older, cynical character reluctantly departs and then suddenly returns. With Beckett, it's a betrayal. With Han, it reveals his heroic nature. Kira's betrayal departure was also in the DNA of Solo from the very beginning. She was always intended to be more complicated and ambiguous than Han, at least at this point in their lives. This was a tricky thing to pull off as you're constantly weighing how invested you want the audience to be in that relationship with properly setting up the chance that she makes the choice that she makes in the end. Again, this was always intended to be just the first and second acts of their story. The third act, the resolution of Han and Kira, has yet to be told. See, I want that story now. If you felt like it was just a cheap stunt, I suppose that's fair. But the truth is that Darth Maul was built into the design of Solo in many subtle ways, including the name Crimson Dawn. The artifacts in Dryden's study and Kira's use of Terrascasi. Maul is my favorite character, writes Jon Kasdan, from the prequel trilogy. I love that Dave Filoni brought him back and expanded his story in Clone Wars and Rebels. I love that there is at least some continuity between the shows and the movies. For me, Maul was destined to pass through Solo as the ultimate Star Wars Kaiser Soze. Will there ever be a sequel? Because it really seems like you guys were setting one up. To be honest, I think the challenge has much more to do with foreign box office than the U.S. Personally, I think there are great Star Wars movies to be made that don't need to cost quite so much. Hopefully, that will be the trend in years to come. And maybe, just maybe, that trend will allow us, one way or another, to tell more stories with Alden, Jonas, Amelia, and Donald. With those actors and Ron Howard, I would jump at the opportunity. Given the way Hollywood and the culture at large seem to run from anything labeled a disappointment, the odds seem like they're against it happening anytime soon. But I suppose Han wouldn't have it any other way. He wraps up with this. We really appreciate the feedback. Love talking about this stuff with fans, and we couldn't be more excited that Solo is now available to anyone who wants to see it anytime they want to. May the Force be with you always. I really do hope now. I really do. I really do hope now that we do get a follow-up film. I would love to see one right now. And I can envision a moment in time where we've got some space between some Star Wars movies and they're able to maybe reduce the budget a little bit and give us a sequel, and that sequel being very, very successful. We've seen that happen with other franchises. Now, albeit Star Wars is much different, but we've seen other franchises go from their original movie and then get bigger, bigger, and bigger and bigger. You look at Fast and Furious, you look at the Mission Impossible movies. I think that now that people have seen this movie, they've gotten past Alden Ehrenreich as being Han Solo. They've been introduced to these characters. I think that the audience would be more than willing to go out into the theater in droves, more so than they did with Solo, to go see a sequel. I think the biggest misstep was probably how close it was to The Last Jedi. We were so used to, as fans, having some distance on these films. And I've talked about this before. There's a number of different factors involved that I think ended up hurting the box office. But at the end of the day, it's going to make money. It's interesting, too. You look at a film that's out right now in The Predator, and it cost twice as much to make as the last Predator film, Predators, that came out, which was really lower budget. I liked both those films a lot. I'm a big Shane Black fan. But Jon Kasdan does make a good point about making these movies a little bit cheaper and not losing any of the quality of them. I think a lot of the money that got spent when it came to Solo was really done because of the reshoots and the amount of money that had to be spent on going and reshooting what some 70% of the film. But man, I really, really would love to see a sequel. I think that would be a lot of fun. And well, I'm not going to go down the road. I've talked about it before, about a Star Wars reboot, because we're still too far off for these particular characters to play their not a reboot, but a redo of A New Hope, to play their roles. I think we're a good decade away from when we get a brand new version of Star Wars A New Hope. But I do believe that one day we will, eventually. I may not be around or alive to see it, but I do believe that we will.
I've seen this raw strength only once before. It didn't scare me enough then. It does now.
All right, just a couple of comments this week for listener feedback. And again, the show's gone a little long this week, so we'll focus a little bit more on your emails and comments on episode 141 next week. But Kylo Ren Extremist writes this, and this is in reference to episode 134. I think Revenge of the Sith still looks very solid. I think every scene on Coruscant and Mustafar look incredible. And again, this ties into what I was talking about earlier in the show about the way that the movies look in and of themselves. And yes, of the prequel movies, I would argue that Revenge of the Sith does look the best out of all of them. The only parts of Revenge of the Sith where the CGI work looks wonky is when we get into the final act of the film and we have the confrontation between Mace Windu and Palpatine. When Anakin shows up, the compositing and the green screen work on those scenes just does not work for me at all. It takes me out every single time I see it. I'd love to see that work redone, because it just seems like an easy fix in my opinion, and something that would not have happened if that movie were made by today's CGI standards. One more, and this is in response to last week's episode. Petra writes this. Thank you for the feedback on my comment, John. I Am You by Depeche Mode is a perfect Reylo song. One of the lyrics is so entwined now that we can't shake free. And there has been so much talk from Ryan and to the Star Wars databank about them having intertwined fates and destinies. Also, they're being described as two halves of the same protagonist fits this song so well. I also listened to the Nine Inch Nails song, and it could be about Anakin. It made me think of him first being entrapped in the Vader armor mask in Revenge of the Sith. It gave me a very claustrophobic feeling. Here's hoping for a better and happy fate for his grandson. Yeah, that song by Nine Inch Nails, Becoming, I swear. If I ever had a chance to interview Trent Reznor, did you write that about Anakin Skywalker? Because, gosh darn it, it really does seem like you did. All right, and that wraps it up for episode 140 of the My Nerd World, a Star Wars podcast. May have a new sponsor again next week. Until then, though, again, thank you for those that have gone and purchased some items, and you still can at MacWeldon.com. They're not paying me to give them a plug, but I just want to be able to support the sponsors when they contribute to the show. So, MacWeldon.com, use that promo code MNW, and you can get 20% off of your first purchase. They really do make fantastic clothes, some great gifts, a lot of accessories there available at the website. And one last time, I'll promote my book coming out. The name of my book, I'm not going to tell you yet. If you want to find out, get on the mailing list. And very soon, within the next few weeks, I will be sending out some emails with some descriptions of what the story is about and when you can expect its official release and in what capacity. Been hard at work at that as well. So if you want to be the first to know about my project that I've been working on for the past few years, again, talkshownerd@gmail.com, and I will add you to the email list. And that list will also be for things about the show as well. So I am planning on using that list not just for promotion of the book, but also to send out alerts and things about the show and sponsorship details and things like that. So talkshownerd@gmail.com. And again, you can find this show on YouTube, Spreaker, Stitcher, Podbean, iTunes. Leave a comment on YouTube as well. Subscribe to any one of those. And I guess that's it. I hope you have yourself a fantastic week. I'm going to go watch some football and some NASCAR racing for the rest of my my Sunday, and probably end up watching Solo at some point again later on this week. So thanks, as always, for downloading. I hope you enjoyed listening as much as I enjoyed recording it, and I'll talk to you again in 1 week.
The Force will be with you, always.
My Nerd World.